planet Earth about to be recycled. Your only chance to evacuate is to leave with us. It was a final message, a warning. And just a short while afterwards, 39 people would be found dead, all with matching uniforms, the same method of death and the same Nike shoes. These are the words of Marshall Applewhite, a humble preacher's son who would transform into a supposed extraterrestrial prophet, urging humanity to attain salvation through a spaceship that would take them to the next level. And though it sounds like a made-up story in the world of science fiction, this is the real story of Heaven's Gate. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded. And today we are diving into one of the most infamous cults in history, and that is Heaven's Gate. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust this windshield into this infamous cult. On May 17, 1931, Marshall Herff Applewhite Jr. was born, the youngest of 4 kids in a small town of Spur, Texas, and his father, Marshall Herff Applewhite Sr., raised a devout and close-knit family. He was a Presbyterian minister who traveled frequently on a mission to establish churches throughout Texas, and he brought the family along with him. So the constant uprooting of home life gave Marshall a mobile upbringing. And tie that along with being a minister's son, and it's not hard to see the pressures and challenges he faced from a very early age. Not giving him a pass, by the way, not even a little bit. But you know we're gonna empathize just a little at the beginning, cause HES, a little kid at this point, alright. So Marshall was brought up in a deeply religious environment, and his family life was rather traditional and strict, largely because of his father's job as a minister. This Marshall Sr. fully expected his kids to live righteously, adhering to Christian morals, and he firmly disciplined them to ensure this. But even with this, it still seemed like Marshall did enjoy his upbringing, embracing the culture fully, and Marshall would regularly attend church, and he was seen as extremely dedicated to the faith. And Marshall demonstrated an intense passion for music and the performing arts, and he possessed a clear aptitude for public speaking as well. And these are all talents and skills that would shape this young man's adulthood on this turn. And his love for the stage led him to take part in theater productions at school, and he also sang in choirs at churches where his voice drew great praise. So his natural charisma and showmanship found many avenues for development, forming a strong foundation for his future persona aka a piece of shit cult leader. But we'll get to that. And in addition to his extracurricular talents, Marshall excelled in his studies as well. HES pretty smart, and one would think this wouldn't be the case due to the constant movement around, but he quickly learned to adapt to new environments regularly. And he was active in various organizations in Corpus Christi High School, and even was president of the school's chapter of the National Honor Society. And he would graduate in 1948. Yet despite his many successes and his attention-grabbing personality, Marshall had growing inner questions about his own identity and his faith. And they had yet to surface in a meaningful way, but they soon would. But for now, he appeared to be following a pretty standard path, a preacher's son, beloved in his own right and perhaps meant to follow in his father's footsteps. Nothing to read flags you why at this point. So, after high school, Marshall enrolled at Austin College in Sherman, Texas. He majored in philosophy, propelled by his deep desire to learn the answer to life's greatest questions. And a former roommate and classmate, John Alexander, recalled that he and Marshall took a liking to one of their professors, Glenn Maxwell, who introduced them to thinkers like Aristotle and Plato and John Locke. And Alexander said of Maxwell, quote, "He really taught you to ask the right kind of questions, to not go along with the crowd," unquote. So Marshall remained an active and involved student, taking part in choirs, councils, and campus associations, further developing his popularity amongst his peers. And Alexander described, quote, "He was an extrovert, he was popular, and he was very smart," unquote. And it's of note that during this time, while he remained religious, he was described as only moderately so compared to his enthusiasm of religion from his youth. So the balance between the spiritual and the artistic continued to shape him. And he graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1952. And around this time, Marshall married Ann Pierce from Corpus Christi, and the couple would eventually have 2 children together. and in hopes of becoming a minister, Marshall enrolled in Union Presbyterian Theological Seminary shortly after graduating from Austin College, finally following in his father's path. So by all appearances, he made smooth progress towards that goal for a short time. However, Marshall only lasted about a year at the seminary as his love of music called to him for more and more. And a seminary official recalled, quote, "He was here less than a year and withdrew in the spring and went into church music," unquote. Upon leaving the seminary, Marshall quickly found work that brought his church background and musical talent together, and he became the music director at First Presbyterian Church in Gastonia, North Carolina in 1953, where he was assistant to the pastor and choir director. And he was still young at this point, around 22 years old, but members of the congregation were very impressed with his gifts, saying, quote, "He was quite a musician and had a beautiful voice," unquote, said Edith Warren, who was a member of the choir Marshall directed. And another member of the congregation described him as drop-dead handsome. When he got up to sing, he looked and sounded like an angel. Teach the run, I don't think so, but all right, whatever you think. So those who watched him became mesmerized by his performances. And Marshall and Ann would spend about 2 years at this church, and they were beloved by all who crossed paths with them. And they even welcomed their first two aforementioned children during this time. So he thrived in his role at the church, utilizing his passions for music with his strong charisma. But life would change rather quickly when he was drafted into the U.S. Army in 1954, and he would be stationed in Austria, New Mexico, and served as a member of the Army Signal Corps for 2 years. And he did his duty diligently, earned an honorable discharge in 1956. And upon his return to civilian life, Marshall chose to further his musical education, enrolling in the University of Colorado Boulder, and he pursued graduate studies in music, focusing on musical theater performance. And he honed his skills as a singer and performer through various roles in operas and musicals. And he did have a pleasing baritone voice and showed a particular fondness for traditional spirituals. So his training sharpened that flair for the theatrical and the stage presence and the vocal talent that had been present throughout his life. And eventually he earned himself a master's degree. And by his 30 seconds, it looked like Marshall had everything going for him. He was formally educated and had lived a life full of different experiences, and he was performing on leading, on serving, and teaching it. He was ambitious and talented and well-liked and respected, and he had a great family with a lot of opportunities ahead of him. But his life would not follow in this path, and his inner turmoil, which he had hidden so well, at this point would soon peek through the cracks. So Marshall set out in the early 1960 seconds to pursue his dream of a career in performing, hoping to become a household name on stage. And he moved to New York, aiming to break into Broadway or the opera circuit, anything to show what he was made of. And he supported his family during this time as a singer and conductor, both in community culture music and commercial music, according to his resume. And the resume also included that he was an occupational therapist at a tuberculosis sanitarium at one point, amongst other odd jobs he held. But unfortunately, his breakout moment eluded him, and Marshall never quite managed to make it to the big stage, generally only landing minor roles in the productions he took part in, causing professional disappointment within him. Yet he still chased his musical calling, but instead through a slightly more stable route. And he would become an assistant professor of music at the University of Alabama, where he was a choir master. But that stability would be challenged when controversy struck, and Marshall was forced to resign from his position. In 1965, some sources say 1960 for after it was discovered that he began a sexual relationship with a male student. Red flag, no. Well, not because HES sleeping with another male, but HES cheating on his wife, and it is a student and they're not supposed to do that. Just want to clarify that. And also, I don't know if this student was underage, but that's a massive red flag, obviously. But such a relationship, both between teacher and student, and at this time a homosexual one, was extremely scandalous and unacceptable in the 1960 seconds in the Deep South. So Marshall's secret was out in one that no one had suspected. So even though he was a married father, he had been wrestling with hidden homosexuality, and then separated from him after learning of the affair in 1965, ultimately divorcing him in 1968. And the breakup was civil, but it affected Marshall deeply cause he genuinely loved his wife and kids, but he was just unable to live the conventional life that was expected of him. Which again, at this point, as long as the kid was underage or anything, and obviously he cheated on his wife, there's no criminal, HES not killing animals, HES not doing all this stuff. But he's doing the thing that falls into what a lot of cult leaders that we've gone over the children of God guy, the Jim Jones guy, is failing at something that they are so determined to do. And right now, if that's music or becoming a star, he can't do that, and it's like a mid. It's almost always a late 20 seconds, early 30 seconds to even 40 seconds, like midlife crisis, failing after failing after failing after failing. And also being charismatic, also being relatively smart, also just being able to public speak. It's like all those things together just create this perfect, albeit horrible cult leader. And so we're seeing that recipe over and over again, and we see it with Heaven's Gate, and we see it with Marshall Applewhite. But anyway, his sister would later recall a story of how he once got a tree outside of Christmas time and painted and decorated it just so the kids could have something fun in the house. And it was just one small example of the type of father he was. In the aftermath of the school affair affected Marshall's relationship with his father. And Marshall finally came out to his parents, hoping they would understand, but sadly Marshall Sr. met his optimism with disapproval and grief, shutting his son out of his life for bringing shame upon the family. So this was just yet another crushing blow, a quote-unquote failure to him in his life. So as if the pain of losing his job, marriage, and kids wasn't enough, he was now basically disowned from his own family, which is a sentiment that potentially fueled his later teachings. So Marshall would then return to Texas with a new resolve to build his life, and he would secure a job as chairman of the music department at the University of St. Thomas. And he was back in his element now, and students saw him as stylish, charismatic, and a good teacher that was able to make music come alive from them. And he became quite popular locally as a singer, directing an Episcopal choir and performing with the Houston Grand Opera in secondary role. So stability seemed to have returned to Marshall, and he even began living as openly gay for a time. But with welcoming the Houston gay scene into his life, he still struggled with sex and relationships internally, which led him to start dating a young woman again. But allegedly facing pressure from her family, she ended things with Marshall, and the breakup devastated him. And to make matters worse, that breakup combined with the guilt and tension he felt from his relationships with men stemming from his religious upbringing and created a push-pull in his sexual life that tormented him. And Marshall allegedly confided with a lover that he desired to have a quote sexless devotion passion without physical entanglements, unquote. So this longing for all of that transcended his personal sexuality was yet another sentiment that fueled his later beliefs as well. And in a stroke of luck, another chance presented itself for Marshall to achieve his performance dreams when he landed lead baritone in the opera The Ballad of a Baby Doer in 1970. But despite the many fans of his voice throughout the years, there were those who didn't believe in him, saying his voice was quote-unquote not of national caliber, and this was an opportunity for him to prove them wrong. But unfortunately, amidst his difficult personal life, the part ended up being too much for him, and he withdrew. And the combination of these many internal issues would push Marshall into several periods of depression, and colleagues began to notice that he became increasingly erratic and withdrawn on campus in the late 1960s. And come March of 1970, Marshall suddenly resigned from his position at St. Thomas, allegedly citing quote-unquote emotional turmoil and depression as the reason. And Robert B. Ewell, C.H. and David Taylor, who were sociologists that later studied Heaven's Gate, theorized that this resignation was actually due to another potentially affair with a male student. And some sources claim that he didn't resign but was actually let go because of this supposed affair. It's not totally clear, so I just want to put that out there, but regardless of the reason, Marshall gave up his academic career, and now he had no job, no family support, and to top it off, his father died around this time, as well, just compounding the pain and unresolved emotions he dealt with. So he up and left Houston and wound up in New Mexico, where he opened a deli in 1970 while attempting to be a simple businessman. And once again, he thrived in an opportunity to connect and interact with people, the same old lovable Marshall. But his mental state continued to decline and he abandoned his deli to return empty-handed to Texas in late 1971, another failure. And he amounted several debts and borrowed money from old friends. And Marshall's life was not looking good at this point, tell you what, because he was alone, wrestling with spiritual issues, ridden with guilt and his sexuality, and just crumbling from the weight of his depression. But this troublesome part of his journey would soon have an unlikely encounter, one that would lead to radical change. So Marshall came to a breaking point in the spring of 1972 when he was hospitalized in Houston, and accounts vary on the why, but it was allegedly for either a heart condition or a psychiatric stay. His own sister Louise later claimed that he had a near-death experience from a blockage in his heart while in the hospital, saying, quote, one of the nurses there told him he had a purpose, that God kept him alive, unquote. But the nurse, who was Bonnie Luttrell Dale, came to him in the hospital bed and marked and convinced him that he was saved for a great mission, Teriel. So just like that, the cherry on top of the cake, years and years for Marshall's longing for more instantly found its focus. And he believed her message was real and divine, and he just knew that God had shown up through this nurse to direct him towards a new path, and that she was the key to unlocking his divine purpose. And Bonnie was a 44-year-old nurse from Houston who had a strong interest in astrology and biblical prophecy, and she was married with children at the time, though her marriage was on the rocks. And while Marshall came from a devout Christian family, Bonnie was more of a seeker of the mystical, and she even wrote about astrology in the local newspaper. But regardless of their backgrounds, they truly believed that their meeting was destiny and their connection was immediate and very powerful. And Marshall said he felt like he had known Bonnie forever, to the point that he felt that they had met in a past life. And Bonnie told Marshall that their meeting had been revealed to her beforehand by extraterrestrials, and that she had been receiving messages from them lucky. So this only further cemented Marshall's inner calling and demonstrated that Bonnie shared it with him. And the two became inseparable, constantly discussing all sorts of spiritual matters, conventional and otherwise. Despite the deep intimacy that the two shared intellectually and spiritually, their relationship was not a sexual one, and this is important as it fulfilled Marshall's desire for that sexless devotion he was desperate for. Bonnie's daughter Terry would later say about the relationship, quote, their relationship was like a romantic thing, more like a friendship, a platonic thing, unquote. So he had finally found someone who understood and accepted him for who he truly was. So prior to their meeting, Bonnie had met with some spiritualists who had told her that a man would soon come into her life, and before she knew it, Marshall was there. And she had actually written a story when she was younger about a man who dies and ascends to heaven, and when Marshall read the story, he was certain that it was actually written about him. Ego complex, am I right? And they quickly decided to fully join forces together in pursuit of their higher calling. And to start, they cut off their remaining earthly ties in order to go all in. So Bonnie's growing relationship with Marshall and her steadily more concerning spiritual ideas led her husband to file for divorce, eventually causing her lose custody of her children in the process, which I think is for the best, to be honest. And Marshall, having already essentially lost his family in his eyes anyway, cut the cord on what was left by permanently breaking contact with his ex-wife, kids and his siblings as well. Classic cult shit, cause they believed they had each other, and that was the only true family they would need, you know. And Marshall eventually moved in with Bonnie, and they were committed to the cause of spiritual exploration, and they opened a bookstore called the Christian Arts Center in Houston that offered spiritual books from different backgrounds. And they also started a teaching center called No Place, as in like I know, like KNOU or whatever, YW. I can't even spell. I need to go to the school, what the fuck. But this No Place was where they offered classes on various mystical and spiritual topics. And the two started referring to each other by nicknames as well, such as Bo for Marshall and Pete for Bonnie, and perhaps to symbolize the idea of shepherds and their flock, like Bo Peep, get it, little Bo Peep, anyway. And more nicknames would come along over time. So in February 1973, Marshall and Bonnie decided to leave their stationary ventures behind in favor of hitting the road to share their insights, because people with egos can't keep shit to themselves no matter how crazy it is. And they had an old car and no source of income, but they trusted the divine would provide for them, and they pawned or gave away the majority of their belongings and kept only necessities, and they even sell their blood for cash from time to time. So fueled by pure purpose, they traveled through the western United States, regularly camping to save money, and sometimes they'd sleep in tents or check into sketchy motels just to skip out on the bill when they left. And money was so tight that simple bread rolls were all they had to survive on. So, the road trip for them was formative, and they created and refined their theology, drawing from a large pool of ideas, and they would study Madame Blavatsky's writings on theosophy, psychology works by our delaying New Age books from Richard Bach, and also enjoyed science fiction novels by Robert Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke. And they also dove deep into the biblical New Testament with a particular focus on the book of Revelation and passages about Christology and asceticism, which is abstinence from earthly pleasures through simple living, and eschatology, which is the focus on the second coming of Christ, which cult leaders just love that shit. Basically, it's like the doomsday stuff, you know. It's like, oh, everything is gonna go to shit when Jesus comes back, or if he doesn't come back and the world ends, and that's just like fear-written stuff. You know, I was terrified of it when I was a kid. The rapture, dude. Every time I woke up, went downstairs and my parents weren't there, I was like, shit. The rapture happened and I am stuck on hell on earth. What the fuck? So with Marshall's seminary background and Bonnie's New Age knowledge, they came to believe that humanity was on the verge of the grand cosmic event and that they were central to what was coming. And furthermore, they were certain that they were the only people who truly understood God's new plan. So the two began to actually see and refer to themselves as the two. Also the UFO, too. It's kind of a lame name, but okay. And they prophesied in the book of Revelation. Cause in Revelation 11 the prophets are killed and then resurrected a few days later, ascending to heaven as the world watches. And they wrote a pamphlet suggesting that Jesus had returned as a Texan. Alright, I'm sorry I cannot help but just picture Jesus coming down with the cowboy hat, spurs on his ankles just like clink, 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 clink with the lasso, and you just hear rhyme back, bitches, you know what I mean. I don't know, sorry Jesus anyway. But this was just a not so subtle claim on behalf of Marshall because, you know, he's a Texan, and preached that they were the fulfillment of this prophecy. And the kingdom of heaven was actually a literal physical place located in outer space, and that spiritually chosen people would be transported in new bodies via a spaceship to the kingdom. Are you with me still? Great. And they also predicted that they would be murdered unresurrected 3.5 days later. That's what Jesus did, by the way. So they're, you know, taking that from that book specifically. One, that spaceship would transport them and their disciples away from Earth, and this was referred to as the demonstration. And it was said that this event would be what proves their divine authority when it happened. And in the meantime, it was their mission to gather those who would be ready to ascend to the next level when that time came, aka the cult members. You know, the cult disciples, if you will. Little biblical word, right there? And by this point, they felt they had a solid outline of their beliefs. So, essentially a combination of apocalyptic Christianity with New Age philosophy and UFO, or rich. You know, on the outside, looking in. Sounds crazy and like kind of cool, but if you're in it, that's fucking terrifying. That I don't know about all that. Sounds like a really good C5 book, honestly. But Marshall and Bonnie managed to convert their first follower a little over a year into their journey, and they resolved to carry their message further. But the recruitment would have to wait a bit, as Marshall was arrested in August of 1970 for shortly after they began for failing to return a rental car. I don't think Jesus would forget to return a rental car, just saying okay. But he had driven it from Missouri down to Harlingen, Texas, and claimed he was divinely authorized to keep the car for the mission. He just pulls out a card and it's him in like replacement of Jesus with the justice on around him and his hands in a prayer position, and he's just like looking like that, like a car salesman, like it's alright, and it just says divinely authorized. And the cop's like, okay, yeah, that passes, that checks out. But the divinely authorized card didn't work, and Marshall was returned to Missouri and spent about 6 months in jail for the theft. But letting nothing halt their progress, he continued refining the theology and efforts to further organize it. He rejoined Bonnie in 1975 without missing a beat, just filled with more clarity and drive than ever before. And their movement was beginning, and it was time to save some souls. So Marshall and Bonnie went on a series of public meetings in 1974 and 1975 to recruit people to the cause, and with little more than posters, their ideas, and their conviction, and probably those definitely authorized cards, they preached their message. And the posters asked readers if they had any interest in quote-unquote reaching the next evolutionary level beyond human, hinting that the key rested with two mysterious visitors. And throughout these meetings, Marshall and Bonnie earnestly claimed that the kingdom of heaven was at hand. An actual spaceship was arriving soon, and those who followed them would escape the catastrophes that would soon take place on Earth and be transported to a higher plane of existence. It's a lot, but if you're like a lost puppy out there and don't know what you're doing and are just looking for some purpose, that sounds pretty cool, you know? So let's talk about the next level, which they described as a perfect place in outer space and used sci-fi and biblical wordings to evoke emotion. But despite their word choices, this was no metaphor to them, and as crazy as it might sound, their demeanor and knowledge of scripture made it seem like a compelling argument to some. One of the most notable meetings took place in Walport, Oregon, on September 14, 1975, as it gained enough attention to launch the UFO cult into the public eye nationally. And as usual, posters were placed throughout the town inviting anyone who would hear to come listen to the two speak of a real physical level beyond Earth's confines. Around 200 people showed up to the Bayshore Inn Motel's meeting, just curious to hear the message, and their Bo and Peep calmly delivered their mind-bending news. And they told people in attendance that they were extraterrestrial beings taking human form here to show the people of Earth how to ascend to the next level before the planet was recycled or, quote, refurbished, spayed de-under, and have another chance to serve as a garden for a future human civilization, unquote, as Marshall himself later said. And those that desire to go should abandon their worldly lives immediately in order to secure a spot on the spaceship to heaven. Again, they love to isolate people from their families, from people that are gonna be like, that sounds fucking stupid, don't do that. But as soon as they get them away, and then you just find a purpose. I always say, like, I don't understand how these people get into these cults, but I honestly, at this point, I do, especially at this time, and you know when you don't know what you're doing. You just went to university, you're trying to find yourself, you know. You just came back from Asia, you. No, and maybe I did some of that. I went to Asia to try to find myself, and honestly, it was a good time. It's a really good time. But yeah, it's just, you know. You come across people who speak really well, that sound really smart, that come up with something that makes you feel special, and it's like, yeah, I can see how people fall into it, you know. So the two sparked curiosity amongst listeners at the comparison at their seemingly outlandish message to their surprisingly ordinary appearance, and one witnessed her mentioned that they were, quote unquote, very unassuming. And indeed, they looked like normal, conservative, middle-aged people, certainly not like the typical person you'd expect conveying this sort of message, yet their common appearance somehow gave a bit of credibility to their words. And when Marshall and Bonnie left Walport short, while later as many as 20 people that had attended the meeting ended up leaving with them, and they gave up leaving with them their families, their jobs, and their belongings to join in the town, were shocked at what had happened. Quote, people just disappeared, unquote, said one of the people that remained from that ceremony. And friends and family didn't know what to think, because they didn't know if their loved ones had been harmed or brainwashed, or what at this point in one man even unsuccessfully chased after the group in hopes of getting his wife to return. And authorities looked into the incident and discovered no troubling evidence, because all those who left did leave willingly, and there was no missing persons reports filed and no evidence of foul play or kidnapping, and investigators determined no laws had been broken. So America had now been introduced to a group that was called the UFO cult, also sometimes referred to as human individual metamorphosis, but you know UFO cults is a little shorter, you know, a little more catchy. So the new converts joined Marshall and Bonnie's now growing group of followers that camped out in various rural areas, while they continued to many of the early people that joined were young adults drawn from alternative lifestyles, interested in meditation, Eastern religions, UFOs, communal living, and whatnot not made. And there were also a couple of people that infiltrated the group as a way to study from within, like sociologist Robert Balch, but not all who joined work out for this way of life, obviously. And one such person was Robert Rubin, who was so convinced by the message that he had given his house away to join, which is, and he stayed with the group for about a year before returning to run a health food store. And another was Annie Miller, who was ready to give up everything for the cause until it was too much, and those that left pointed to extremely strict commitments that were demanded of them as something that most people could not maintain. But many did stay, and the group's numbers supposedly reached around 100 or more members throughout the Western US by late 1975, and some estimates say the group reached to 200 people at its peak, and they were called the quote doomsday UFO cult in the media. And reporters actively pursued any chance at the story, and a book titled UFO Missionaries Extraordinary was released in 1976 as one of the first published stories of the group. And as publicity skyrocketed, so did Marshall and Bonnie's fears, which led them to drop out of the public eye for a period of time, and instead of letting their followers carry on their recruitment life within the group, which as a whole was sometimes called the class, and members were sometimes called crew, was not told conventional by any means. But despite the harsh conditions, many members were disarmingly ordinary people who just believed they were on a spiritual mission, and they were instructed to set up makeshift campgrounds in remote locations, and all belongings and money were to be surrendered to a common pool for the group, and they lived collectively and essentially had no contact with anyone outside of the group. So just complete isolation, complete control. Nobody could leave, cause nobody had anything to leave with. It was just a classic cult. And extreme obedience was demanded from the start, because they had to give up all earthly attachments, including their families, friends, sex, drugs, fried foods, you name it. And they even had to give up their birth names, and they were controlled and stripped of their individuality. And Joan Culpepper, an early member who later left and became a critic, said, quote, "Most cults want to sweet talk you. These guys weren't like that," unquote. And the two offered a difficult road to salvation, but many found meaning in the harsh discipline, and members would address their leaders by their new names. Marshall is doing Bonnie as T, instead of Bo and Peep, it's doing T, like do re mi fa sol la, like do re mi fa sol la, like do re mi fa. So la-dee-do, I'll go on to next month anyway. And the followers would follow their every command without hesitation, and as the group continued to grow, Marshall and Bonnie became uncomfortable with the significant attention from the larger crowds and Associated Press, so they chose to downsize the group, and they began weeding out members who they felt weren't totally devoted to the cause or created any sort of friction. Just try to get the bad apples out so nobody can try to corrupt within. And since too many eyes were looking at them, they're like, ooh, there's too much possibility that someone's actually gonna say that we're full of shit, so they were like, we gotta consolidate this shit, alright. And some were quietly encouraged to leave and were given financial assistance to leave. But those who remained were the truest of believers, the OGS, diehards, if you will, willing to follow do-and-tea literally anywhere. And Marshall had a quality over quantity approach to his flock, and to avoid drawing further attention, they broke the group up into subgroups or star clusters, which a kind of love that traveled separately but would regroup at pre-chosen locations. And these sorts of tactics kept authorities off their scent, while also reinforcing the desired isolation of the cult itself, and doing team maintained control over the scattered star clusters through writings and assistance. So as the early 1982 arrived, Marshall and Bonnie had fully settled into their lives as cult leaders, and though the group had once roamed and lived on various campgrounds, they shifted towards living a stable yet secretive life. And after receiving a large sum of money, potentially through inheritance or followers' donations, they began to rent houses, initially in Denver, then Texas, and later a mansion in California to use as group homes. And though they did cover windows to prevent prying eyes, they passed as an innocent communal living arrangement for appearance's sake, to keep nosy neighbors at bay. While in actuality their lifestyle was enforced with military-level discipline, and members were paired up with partners to keep each other accountable, and daily routines were scheduled essentially down to the minute, very Jim Jones of them. Nobody could ever be left alone, and everybody had to rat on somebody else if somebody was doing something bad. It's just like military, like I'd say even worse than military-like conditions. And Marshall felt that an individual individual's ego and human habits were obstacles that prevented spiritual progress, so he made it a point to create an environment that squashed personal identity in the cult's already strict lifestyle, only grew more strict over time. And members experimented with a number of different diets in an attempt to purify their bodies. Quote, "We tried every diet out there to see its effect on the body. From fruitarian to wheatgrass to low-cooked grains to juice-only consumption, I'd be out shit. I'd be out at this point. I'd be like, alright, you know. Was cool with the divine authority cards and shit, but this is too much. Okay, I'm joking anyway." But they eventually settled on a boring but practical diet. Quote, "You would have a grain cereal in the morning followed by a low-fat sandwich for lunch, no fried. Foods such as French fries and dinner would consist of a carefully prepared protein with vegetables," unquote. And they followed specific schedules for everything, and not only was sex banned, but so was romance of any kind, and Marshall was so hell-bent on removing sexual distraction that he encouraged castration for any men that still struggled with their libido. That fucking horrible, like physical castration, just changing there is changing there. Lives in that, ugh, it's just anyway, yeah. You just tell me, yeah, just terrible. And to the point that he went with a few male followers down to Mexico, where they would all undergo surgical castration, which is, for those of you who don't know, the voluntary removal of their testicles to remain celibate, so a major body alteration, a permanent body alteration. And though this was kept secret at the time, it was later discovered by the medical examiner as the bodies were checked after the final incident, but we will get to that in a bit. But the castrations just demonstrated just how far Marshall was willing to go to control his followers, and it also potentially showed just how deep his own sexual trauma influenced him. And members were forced to wear identical baggy clothing, generally something like plain shirts and sweatpants, which we've seen with other cults as well, and they were given the same haircut in attempt to mask gender and sexuality, hiding their differences. And Marshall and Bonnie had everyone adopt new first names that had 3 consonants, specifically in the first syllable, undented in OD to symbolize their birth into the group and reinforce group identity. For instance, G-Modi or Leva D spelled J-M-M-O-D, Y or L-V-V-O-D-Y. And one-on-one relationships and cliques were forbidden, and if 2 members began to seem like they were getting too close, they were broken up and assigned to separate tasks and partners. And an investigator later noted, quote, "Nothing in the house indicated members exhibited any individuality. There were no books, magazines, or movies other than about 100 homemade videotapes similar to the one the group made as a final goodbye," unquote. So just no outside influence or outlets at all in the group. Environment was that of an echo chamber and permanently reinforcing the cult's mindset. Marshall's brand of leadership involved a mix of fatherly warmth and absolute authority. And though he was strict excessively, so followers saw him as a father figure in their guiding shepherd, and he generally was soft-spoken, and he appeared to genuinely care whenever he offered help to a troubled member, but he also would not hesitate to punish anyone who disobeyed, and even a minor slip-up was met with swift correction until the person repented. So he led with charisma and fear, and the charisma was seen through followers' real adoration and belief that he was truly divinely guided, and the fear was seen through members desperately avoiding anything that would disappoint him, resulting in being left behind at the time of ascension. And according to former members, there was also an underlying threat that if you did decide to leave the group, you were forfeiting your spot on the spaceship and suffering for it. And because of this, even when doubts began to surface, many members would decide to stay in the world that Du and T built, and understandably so. But a significant turning point for the group came in 1985 when their beloved leader T passed away from cancer on June 19th, and her passing utterly devastated Marshall and the prophecy had always foretold that they would ascend together, but now their bullshit, their prophecy was different, cause Bonnie's solo death seemed to directly contradict everything he had believed and preached. So Marshall was lost, but he was able to put himself back together and decided to reinterpret T's passing in a way that actually supported the cult's beliefs, and he began to tell his followers that she had simply returned to the next level before them. How convenient Marshall and her human body had become worn out, so she left it to continue the work from beyond, and he greatly emphasized that she was still working on watching over them, and she had just graduated all right. So this shift was very significant to their theology, whereas before they believed that they would ascend physically into the spaceship. Now it was taught that their human bodies were only vessels, and shedding this earthly form could be a requirement to actually reach the next level, which isn't good because that means all they need to do is die. So Bonnie's death forced Marshall to accept that death could still be a part of the plan and planted the seed that they all might need to voluntarily exit their vessels at some point in time. So Marshall was now the sole leader in Bonnie's permanent absence, despite believing she was still actively playing a part, and he began saying that T had been the Heavenly Father to his role as son, and he later claimed in a recording that my father came to earth with me, this time unquote in the form of a woman body, and then returned back to the heavens. And with this claim he established his true authority, and he now taught that he was the current version of Christ, and as such the only source of truth from the next level. Quote, that mind that was in Jesus, what that mind, that spirit, that soul is me, unquote. God thinks he's Jesus Christ, what's new, you know. So the second coming has happened, and he was here now, so most followers thought this revelation made sense and took it wholeheartedly, and they felt the wisdom and love that radiated from Do. And if Do said that T was God the Father and that he was the Son Jesus, that it must be the truth. Okay, raise your hand if you've been putting off a doctor's appointment, cause when something feels off. I usually doom scroll my symptoms, self-diagnosing on the internet, and then I just kind of hope it goes away. Sound familiar? Well, this year we're doing things differently with ZOC Doc. Okay, and ZOC Doc is a free app and website that helps you find and book high-quality in-network doctors, so you can find someone who you love. We're talking over 150,000 providers across all 50 states, whether you need a dentist, a dermatologist, a primary care doctor, or any of the 200 specialties that they offer. And you can read thousands of verified patient reviews to get a real sense of who your doctor actually is, which I find very helpful. And when you're ready, see their real-time availability and book instantly. There's no playing phone ag, and appointments happen fast, typically within 24 to 72 hours, and you can even score some same-day appointments. I personally have used ZOC Doc for almost a year now, and you should so stop putting off those doctor's appointments and go to ZOCDoc.com/chem to find and instantly book a doctor you love today. That's ZOCDoc.com/chem, ZOCDoc.com/chem. Thank you so much to ZOC Doc for supporting the channel and sponsoring this video, and let's get back to it. So through the late 1980s, the group continued to live their quiet, secretive lives, and now it was time to move to San Diego, California, where they rented a mansion in the wealthy Rancho Santa Fe area, and as a source of income they turned to tech-based jobs, and many members were educated and some already had backgrounds in tech, and they founded a small business called Higher Source. See what you did there under Marshall's guidance, where they did website design and various other programming services, a perfect fit with the growing .com industry, and members did their work under aliases for protection. The adoption of an early internet-based business has led some people to refer to Heaven's Gate, as they would call themselves by the mid-1990s, as the first internet cult. Now right, and they also launched their own website called Heaven's Gate by 1996 in order to further reach people with their teachings online, because Marshall saw tech and all of its advancements as a tool to convert people to the cause and support the mission, all while continuing to stay isolated, and any group members that worked outside of the home still kept up with their strict lifestyle and refrained from any socialization. Yet despite their generally low-profile existence, Marshall was still convinced that the end of the world was fast approaching, and in the early 1990s he decided to make his final public attempt to draw new members to salvation, and in 1993, a rather prominent ad appeared in USA Today. The headline read UFO cult resurfaces, with final offering. That ad, along with several others placed in different papers and magazines, proclaimed the general message they've been stating this whole time, that the earth would soon be recycled, and any and all people were invited to learn how to avoid destruction through evacuation. And they also made a series of videos titled Beyond Human, the last call that aired on satellite TV in 1990, to featuring Marshall on a simple set preaching the doom of the human race, and only a select few that were willing to break all connections to their human ways would ascend. People fell, they fell more, they became, they got their eyes off their Heavenly Father. They weren't that interested in what He desired for them. They were interested in what their desires were, the desires of their flesh. How the fuck was this allowed on TV? I'll never know, but according to some, his charisma was on another level, as his resolve had never been greater. Speaking with great urgency, yet calm, as he urged viewers that this was their final chance and it would soon be too late, and a few viewers took him up on the offer, including a few former members that decided to rejoin, but mostly the message fell on deaf ears. So by 1996, Heaven's Gate had come down to around 39 members, potentially a few more, as there are still some remaining today, though so astronomers discovered in 1995 that comet Hale-Bopp was approaching Earth and would pass by closely sometime around 1996 to 1997, and rumors also circulated that there was a mysterious object that was trailing just behind the comet, and some believe this could be a UFO. So when Marshall learned of this news, he was naturally ecstatic, cause this is going right along with his prophecy, because he had been preaching of a sign to come from the next level that told it was time to finally leave Earth, and he was wholly convinced that Hale-Bopp was that sign, and the rumored tailing object was the long-awaited spacecraft. So Heaven's Gate triumphantly updated their website, still visible to this day, by the way, to declare Hale-Bopp's approach is the marker we've been waiting for. The time for the arrival of the spacecraft from the level above human to take us home to their world in the literal heavens. Our 22 years of classroom here on planet Earth is finally coming to conclusion. Graduation from the human evolutionary level. We are happily prepared to leave this world and go with T's crew." Unquote. So this window of ascension had arrived at last, and the Earth's recycling would soon begin, and the only way to survive was to leave with them. So the group's excitement was at an all-time high, because years of sacrifice and disciplined living was going to finally pay off, or so they thought. So they circled the date that Hale-Bopp would be closest to Earth in March 1997, and plans were set to exit the world to join the spaceship that they believe was en route for them. And in the weeks leading up to the comet's arrival, the group made a series of farewell messages, and many members sat in front of cameras, and some alone and some together, and delivered their exit statement, which were these ominously upbeat testimonials where they smiled and talked about how happy they were and confident in the decision that they had made and what they were about to do. And it's extremely unsettling to watch. I don't think any of us could be more happy. Okay, that's all we got to say. But the videos had a dual purpose, in that they not only acted as members' final goodbyes, but also they hoped that they might save any last souls that would they see them before the end. And they even wrote up a press release entitled "Away Team Returns to Level Above Human," in which they framed their departure as a homecoming rather than a mass exit. The night before the big moment on March 21st, the group went to one of their favorite restaurants, Miracle Enders, to enjoy a final outing together, and they all ordered the exact same meal: turkey pot pie, iced tea, and cheesecake with blueberries for dessert. In this Last Supper, another Jesus callback demonstrated their connectance and devotion to each other and the cause in complete unison down to the very last, by ready to take the next step into their grand journey together. So starting on March 22nd, the members of Heaven's Gate began the process of their graduation that we now see as mass exit. And I mean, I can't say that word on YouTube, cause YouTube doesn't like that word, but I'm assuming you know what I mean. So the deaths were carried out in stages, which were outlined in a note later discovered in the home. Quote, 15 classmates, sate assistants, then 15 more undate. Assistants then help each other, unquote. So staggering the scheduled deaths in this way helped make sure that the earlier ones could be taken care of by those that followed. And each member had a bunk or bed prepared as their final resting place, complete with a purple cloth to be placed over their body. Once they passed, they also had a small travel bag placed next to them, including identification and a few dollars. And some sources say members initiated their graduation by eating applesauce poisoned with a lethal dose of sedatives, while others say it was a combination of sedatives and or alcohol. But whatever the initial combo was, each combo. Member then had a plastic bag placed over their head to guarantee death by asphyxiation should the drugs fail to do their job, and investigators later found instructions in the house stating, quote, use plastic bag to be sure, unquote. In toxicology reports later showed that some members actually did not have a fatal dose in their system, suggesting that the bags may have actually been the cause of their death, or that one of the helpers that stayed behind had helped in once the members had passed on the helpers, then removed the plastic bags from the helpers, passed and placed the purple cloths over the bodies in preparation for the next stage of deaths, which would take place over the next few days. And allegedly 44-year-old Susan Strom was the last to go in her body, was the only one found with a plastic bag still around her head, which suggests no one had been alive to remove it for her, and Marshall himself was one of the last for to pass, and the coroner noted that he had severe heart disease, which may have caused the sedatives to work faster on him, and he was discovered in the master bedroom dressed as the other's eyes closed, and after these many years of preaching this day would come, Marshall had finally taken his grand exit, fully convinced he would join his beloved Bonnie in the next level. And deputies from the San Diego County Sheriff's Department arrived at the mansion in response to a 911 call on March 26th, and the call was allegedly made by Rio D'Angelo, also called Richard, for an ex-member that reportedly received instructions to take over the cult's business and discovered the scene when he came to the house. And as authorities searched the premises, they found the bodies all lying in the same peaceful pose with their matching clothing, purple cloth covering a Nike shoes and walking room. It looked like 39 people had just decided it was time to go to sleep together. But the mansion would be soon flooded with law enforcement, and of course the media circus followed, attempting to grab any photos and information they could get their hands on images of corpses still on their bunks with their fresh black and white Nikes clearly visible in what almost seemed like a dark hat for the brand. And even Saturday Night Live would run a skit poking fun at the cult's Nikes, and clips of the strange exit videos left by Heaven's Gate members were aired on EV networks. And the public as a whole found the situation hard to understand, and they weren't for store coerced like in Jonestown. These people left seemingly willingly in the pursuit of a sci-fi-esque salvation, and autopsies confirmed that all deaths were from a combination of either sedative poisoning or asphyxiation. And in the wake of the tragedy, all remaining materials, possessions of Heaven's Gate were gathered unsorted in the Heaven's Gate website was found to essentially be their exit note, illustrating Marshall's sentiment, quote, we are happily prepared to leave this world, unquote. And as mentioned, the site is still operational and maintained today, and all personal items were removed from the mansion and later put up for auction by the county. And Rio D'Angelo engaged in a legal battle with the county over ownership rights of Heaven's Gate's sole business asset hire source, but the county treated it like any other part of the estate and liquidated the business, giving proceeds to the families of the deceased. And though the initial shock and awe of the Heaven's Gate mass exit had essentially worn off within a few months, the situation left a number of unanswered questions that people would debate for years to come, because how is it that so many seemingly educated, unintelligent people could be convinced to exit in such a strange way? And what does this say about the power of charismatic people in search for meaning and purpose in life? Marshall's life journey from devoutly religious Southern preacher, son, family man, music teacher, and performer to self-proclaimed prophet of an apocalyptic UFO cult remains to be one of the most fascinating cautionary tales in recent history. What began as a rather ordinary story quickly became shaped by a number of personal crises mixed with an unmet spiritual purpose, and this ultimately plummeted into the realm of delusion with extreme and lethal consequences. He possessed such great talent and a lovable personality, yet was never able to conquer his demons until he created a grandiose purpose for himself, unarguably. These demons were never defeated in that they showed themselves through how Marshall controlled his followers and his severe struggles with his sexuality, inability to conform to what was expected of him, and the loss of his soulmate all played their own part in pushing Marshall into a narrative that placed himself as the sole possessor of truth and the only one who knew how to achieve salvation. To combine Marshall's theology with the era of fascination with C-Phylorant extraterrestrials, that was the 1972 through 1992, and you have a cult that was just as much a product of the time as it was born of his mind, and the broader implications of this being that cult leaders are often uniquely positioned to arise when serious personal desperation meets cultural fascination, and in this case, Heaven's Gate UFO conspiracy blended beautifully with rapture-based Christian doctrine. And when looking at the 38 members who died alongside of Marshall in the end, these people didn't fit the normal crazy cultist stereotypes. They were just regular people, many with above average intelligence, but what they had in common was a longing for something deeply spiritual and openness to pervading UFO and alternate belief systems that Marshall's message satisfied. And Joan Culpeper, the aforementioned Dex member turned critic, said, quote, "Many of these people weren't losers with low self-esteem. Applewhite's message connected to some belief in them." Unquote, Heaven's Gate provided a vision of purpose, community, and ultimately a level of transcendence that these people were willing to give their lives for. Quote, "The true meaning of exit is to turn against the next level when it is being offered done," quote, as was written on their website. And if normal people with any sort of intelligence can be exploited by charisma and desire for belonging and purpose, we're forced to recognize that this sort of thing can happen to just about anyone under the right conditions. But still, the line of brainwashing versus true choice is heavily debated, and Marshall always claimed that members were free to disobey and leave, but with the underlying fear of damnation ever present. So how free were they really? And even the members demonstrating happiness with their situation, was this simply the illusion of choice? I don't know, but with Do and T's overly strict structure and demands micromanaging every part of members' lives and isolating them for further control, it's hard to say that coercion wasn't occurring on at least some level. But in the end, whether coerced or truly free, well, we're left with a story in which the deep search for spiritual meaning and purpose led to a tragic loss of 39 lives that left families and friends behind, families who were confused, hurt, angry, grieving, and overall struggling with the loss of their loved ones taken from them much too soon. So my heart goes out to all those families and to the victims, cause they really are truly victims in this but that is that for the Heaven's Gate cult. If you have any other cases, cults, conspiracies, serial killers you want me to look into, let me know in the comments below. I always read them. And until then, I will see your beautiful face. Okay, stay safe out there. Bye.